We're going to move forward with John Wood. John, good afternoon. Thank you for appearing today to give testimony. Whenever you're ready to proceed, go ahead.
Thank you, Senator Galvin, for hosting this hearing, and Chairman Grisanti for your environmental leadership, for your sponsorship of Senate Bill 4616 in the last legislative session, and for the invitation to assist this committee's examination of hydraulic fracturing wastewater issues. My name is John Wood. I'm a legal fellow with the Natural Resources Defense Council. NRDC is a national not-for-profit environmental organization with more than 200,000 members in this state. NRDC has worked for over 40 years to protect New York's people and environment. For the past several years, we have dedicated substantial efforts to the issue of proposed new natural gas development in New York State, urging that the state take an extremely cautious approach and ensure that no new drilling is allowed to proceed unless and until it can be demonstrated to be safe. Today's hearing will illuminate many issues of concern regarding hydraulic fracturing wastewater. To make the most of this opportunity, I recommend the transcript of this hearing be submitted to the Department of Environmental Conservation as a public comment on the revised draft supplemental generic environmental impact statement for natural gas development. Hydraulic fracturing wastewater management is among the most vexing issues faced by states such as Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio, which are currently developing their shale formations. It would be highly imprudent for New York to move forward with proposed new hydraulic fracturing without a plan in place to deal with the billions of gallons of wastewater that will inevitably be generated by this activity. According to Department of Environmental Conservation Commissioner Joe Martens, currently no wastewater treatment plants in New York are equipped to treat or permitted to accept wastewater with the range of contaminants expected to be in fluids produced by high-volume hydraulic fracturing. Natural gas drilling operators are not wastewater management experts. Without guidance and regulatory enforcement, improper wastewater management could jeopardize public drinking water supplies and public health and impair aquatic ecosystems. In addition to a general discussion about the nature of hydraulic fracturing wastewater, I'll answer three questions. What are the primary disposal options for hydraulic fracturing wastewater and the environmental and human health concerns associated with each option? What is DEC doing on the ongoing review under the State Environmental Quality Review Act with respect to the regulation of hydraulic fracturing wastewater? And lastly, how does Senate Bill 4616 relating to the uniform treatment of waste from the exploration, development, extraction, or production of crude oil and natural gas address the problems associated with hydraulic fracturing wastewater? To save the suspense, I'll answer in brief these questions right now. There are limited options for hydraulic fracturing wastewater disposal, and each disposal method poses significant challenges to the environment and human health. New York lacks the infrastructure for, and DEC has no regulatory plan to deal with the prodigious amounts of potentially hazardous wastewater that will be generated from hydraulic fracturing. Finally, the bill introduced last year in the New York Senate passed in the Assembly as Assembly Bill 7313 to provide for the uniform treatment of wastewater is a critical development, as it would close the existing loophole in federal and state law. Senate Bill 4616 would require hydraulic fracturing wastewater to be disposed of according to the same practices that apply to waste from every other industry. NRDC encourages you to reintroduce and quickly pass this bill in the coming legislative session. Now we'll discuss the nature of hydraulic fracturing wastewater in terms of quality. I recently watched a video on the Independent Oil and Gas Association of New York website where a vice president of one of these companies claimed that the additives they used are edible. Many of the chemical additives used in hydraulic fracturing fluid are known or probable carcinogens. In April of this year, United States House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce released a report summarizing the volume and content of hydraulic fracturing drilling fluid products used by 14 of the nation's leading companies. Between 2005 and 2009, the oil and gas service companies use products containing 29 chemicals that are known or possible human carcinogens regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act for their risk to human health, or listed as hazardous air pollutants under the Clean Air Act. The BTEX compounds, benzene, toluene, xylene, and ethylbenzene, are Safe Drinking Water Act contaminants and hazardous air pollutants. Benzene specifically is a known human carcinogen. And in the period of study, there were 11.4 million gallons of products containing at least one BTEX chemical used. Furthermore, flowback water is high in total dissolved solids, chlorides, surfactants, gelling agents, and metals from spent gel and foam fracturing fluids. Typical classes of parameters present in flowback fluid are dissolved solids like sulfates and calcium, metals such as magnesium, barium, and strontium, suspended solids, mineral scales like calcium carbonate and barium sulfate, and bacteria, friction reducers, iron solids such as iron oxide and iron sulfide, dispersed clay fines, colloids, and silts, and acid gases such as carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide. The chemical additives are only one piece of the problem of hydraulic fracturing wastewater. Because the water used in hydraulic fracturing comes into close contact with the shale formation during the well stimulation process, when it returns to the surface it may contain a variety of formation materials that can make wastewater treatment difficult and expensive. The production brines often contain relatively high concentrations of sodium, chloride, bromide, and other inorganic constituents such as arsenic, barium, and other heavy metals, total dissolved solids, naturally occurring radioactive material, and all of these significantly exceed safe drinking water standards. So both the chemical additives and the formation materials lace the wastewater generated by hydraulic fracturing, rendering it unsafe to discharge without extensive treatment. Now, to give the problem of hydraulic fracturing wastewater its due respect, we should also consider the issue of volume. I will use DEC's estimates for future development of the Marcellus Shale to build this scenario. Marcellus development is projected over a 30-year life cycle. The average year would see 1,600 or more wells. The amount of water consumed in each well is projected between 2.4 and 7.8 million gallons, and the average well consumes 4.2 million gallons of water. Between 9% and 35% of hydraulic fracturing wastewater returns to the surface. Assuming one so-called frac job occurring in every well in the state, hydraulic fracturing operations would ultimately generate between 18 and 71 billion gallons of wastewater over the next 30 years. If each well is fracked twice over its 30-year life, we'll see between 36 and 142 billion gallons of hydraulic fracturing wastewater generated in New York. And at different times, the chemical compounds in this wastewater differ, and so it will require extensive monitoring during the flowback process to know exactly what's in the wastewater. So wastewater quality and quantity pose capacity challenges to New York's limited wastewater management infrastructure, which I'll discuss next. There are a few disposal options in New York. It's among one of the most critical questions New York faces when deciding whether to open up our shale formations, is what to do with the huge quantities of toxic, potentially radioactive wastewater that comes from fracked wells. Existing wastewater infrastructure in this state is simply not designed to accept wastewater of the sort produced by hydraulic fracturing activities. There are four main disposal options: underground injection, recycling, publicly owned treatment works, and privately owned wastewater treatment facilities. With any of these methods, water must be shipped from the drill site to the treatment or disposal facility. Suppose 2 million gallons of wastewater are generated with each frac job, and with the capacity of a water tanker truck averaging about 5,000 gallons, each frac job would require 400 truck trips from the drill site to the wastewater treatment facility, which may be in an entirely different state, perhaps as far away as Ohio or West Virginia. Now, that will occur no matter which option we choose. Now, for underground injection, the risks associated with this method are aquifer contamination, toxic plumes, insufficient storage capacity, and, of course, the risks involved in shipping hazardous waste from New York to Ohio or West Virginia. Deep well wastewater injection is regulated by the U.S. EPA and is regarded by some experts as marginally better than sending waste to treatment facilities, but a Government Accountability Office study found instances of drinking water contamination from cracked or poorly plugged injection wells. Underground injection of wastewater may be linked to induced seismicity or man-made earthquakes resulting from high-pressured fluid injections, a rash of which have occurred in Texas, Arkansas, Ohio, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and even England, conspicuously close to hydraulic fracturing fluid injections. For publicly owned treatment works, POTWs are basically designed for municipal sewage. They rely on biological processes and simple chemicals such as chlorine to treat wastewater. Because these facilities are not designed to treat hazardous waste, sending hydraulic fracturing wastewater to them could create pass-through problems that jeopardize the water quality of receiving water bodies. The combination of bromide from the shale formations and chlorine from the treatment plant can create trihalomethanes in public water supplies, which are linked to cervical cancer and birth defects. Treatment of this wastewater may increase water costs to end consumers. Our neighboring states have been trying to figure out how to deal with mounting evidence that hydraulic fracturing wastewater was sent to overburdened facilities and discharged into nearby rivers without adequate treatment. Without adequate regulation, surface and groundwater bodies could be contaminated with high salt levels, heavy metals, volatile organic chemicals, radioactive materials, and cancer-causing compounds. And further, pretreatment has been discussed simply does not solve the capacity issue in terms of volume. Many of these treatment facilities are currently operating at capacity already. Privately owned wastewater treatment plants are another option as an alternative to public treatment works. These are massive construction projects for which New York has little to no experience. Centralized, privately owned treatment plants present a host of human health and environmental impacts that simply were not analyzed by DEC. Notably, drilling operations from the entire region around a privately owned treatment works would foreseeably ship their wastewater by truck or pipeline to this facility, which will cause truck traffic impacts and, in the case of pipelines, ecosystem fragmentation. There are also serious questions about the energy intensity of treatment technologies at industrial wastewater treatment facilities. And let me make a point about the publicly owned treatment works. NRDC has documents on file obtained through a Freedom of Information Law request that suggest that the towns of Auburn and Watertown have accepted hydraulic fracturing wastewater treatment facilities as late as 2009 with the approval of the DEC. Just to correct a point. And as far as recycling goes, while wastewater recycling is, at least in theory, a positive development because it reduces waste and conserves freshwater resources, ultimately there is a highly concentrated toxic waste left over that still needs to be disposed of somehow, but it is still exempt from hazardous waste rules. Waste injected over and over again is typically more toxic than when it's first used. There is little information available from industry about exactly what technologies they're using to recycle wastewater, and there's scant verifiable information from industry on how much waste is actually being recycled, since they don't have to report these numbers. Of course, some companies claim to be recycling 100% of their wastewater, while others say the high salt levels make that claim implausible, if not impossible, because of the likely corrosive effect that that water would have on their equipment. Recycling may also be energy intensive. For the moment, claims by industry that recycling wastewater will ameliorate the concerns raised here must be regarded with skepticism. And there are also possible impacts resulting from temporary storage tanks proliferating as operators wait for a backlog of disposal permits as they generate the waste. Now I'll discuss DEC's approach to wastewater under SECRA. In short, the DEC has no meaningful plan to address the massive problem of hydraulic fracturing wastewater. It is of serious concern that they're preparing to issue permits to drill without having a regulatory plan in place for dealing with this. The United States EPA as well as DEC have both stated that traditional publicly owned wastewater treatment works are not capable of processing waste generated from hydraulic fracturing operations. For this reason, it is a concern that DEC says flowback water may be sent to POTWs, and the same section in which they conclude that the high concentration of TDS present in this source of wastewater may prove to be inhibitory to the biological wastewater treatment systems. Of all 1,500 pages of DEC's environmental impact statement for hydraulic fracturing and their proposed regulations, DEC never lays out a coherent wastewater management plan, and it fails to analyze the risks involved in each of the different disposal methods. Commissioner Martens has suggested that waste should simply be shipped to Pennsylvania or Ohio. Another glaring omission from DEC's environmental impact statement, which should be a concern to everyone, is the failure to conduct any health impact assessment whatsoever, despite the fact that allowing hydraulic fracturing in New York means that billions of gallons of carcinogen-laced water will be pumped into New York lands, shipped over New York roads, or disposed of somehow in New York wastewater infrastructure. NRDC hopes the Senate's leadership will correct defects such as this by calling on the DEC to analyze the health impacts of hydraulic fracturing before issuing permits for it. The closest thing to a wastewater plan is DEC's proposed ad hoc manifest system, which would enable regulators to track the transport of wastewater. which may assist in the prevention of illegal discharges, but in no way does this qualify as an adequate risk mitigation measure. To quote, DEC's waste tracking procedure is similar to that which is required for medical waste, even though the hazards are not equivalent. Since, quote, manifesting is not required for non-hazardous industrial commercial waste, it is strange that DEC proposes a manifest system for hydraulic fracturing waste in spite of their regulatory position that it's not hazardous, and in spite of the fact that DEC uses the word hazard to describe it. If hydraulic fracturing wastewater is hazardous, then DEC should regulate it as such. Because DEC has not proposed a wastewater management plan for hydraulic fracturing wastewater, apparently its strategy is to wait and see for industry to decide which disposal method they prefer, at which point DEC would then conduct an analysis of the corresponding environmental impacts. This post hoc assessment of impacts is a violation of the purpose of SECRA, which requires government decision makers to analyze significant adverse impacts before taking actions that would bring them about. Now, what can the Senate do? Hydraulic fracturing operators currently enjoy a loophole in environmental law exempting the waste generated by their activities from regulation as a hazardous substance, despite the fact that it contains hazardous constituents. Last session's Senate Bill 4616 would close this loophole. By way of context, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, Subtitle C, or RCRA, creates a federal program that manages hazardous waste from cradle to grave. There are Subtitle C regulations for the generation, transportation, treatment, storage, and disposal of hazardous wastes. However, waste, quote, uniquely associated with the exploration, development, and production of natural gas at primary field operations, such as produced water or spent hydraulic fracturing fluids, are exempt from regulation under RCRA Subtitle C. Because of this exemption, most shale gas extraction wastewater is by legislative fiat not, quote, hazardous within the meaning of RCRA. Hence, POTWs receiving exempt oil and gas extraction wastewaters would not be receiving hazardous waste and thus would not need to meet RCRA permit requirements. NRDC has petitioned EPA to update RCRA to regulate exploration and production wastes, which would include waste streams generated by Marcellus shale drilling. In the meantime, states can of their own accord regulate these waste streams. This is an opportunity for New York to seize. There is also a loophole at the state level. Oil and gas development wastes are currently excluded from the Environmental Conservation Law definition of hazardous waste through DEC's regulatory disposition. This exclusion could either be removed through regulatory amendment or superseded by statute. The ECL defines hazardous waste broadly by characteristic. It means a waste or combination of wastes which, because of its quantity, concentration, or physical, chemical, or infectious characteristics, may cause or significantly contribute to an increase in mortality or an increase in serious, irreversible, or incapacitating reversible illness, or pose a substantial present or potential hazard to human health or the environment when improperly treated, stored, transported, disposed, or otherwise managed. Clearly, hydraulic fracturing wastewater fits this characteristic. It is by regulatory fiat that natural gas development wastes are currently excluded from the statute's application. This is so despite the fact that under the statute's expansive definition, these wastes may pose a substantial hazard to human health and the environment. Senate Bill 4616 closes this loophole. In order to bring natural gas development waste back under the purview of New York's Hazardous Waste Management Program, the regulatory exclusion must either be removed through an amendment to these regulations or superseded by an act of the legislature. DEC, of course, could commence a new rulemaking in light of the substantial evidence demonstrating the hazardous nature of these wastes in terms of their quantity, concentration, or physical, chemical, or infectious characteristics. Alternatively, the legislature could overcome this regulatory stalemate on this issue by amending the relevant sections of the ECL to require the DEC to consider whether natural gas development wastes are potentially hazardous. Senate Bill 4616 would require the uniform treatment of wastewater regardless of its source. If it tests as hazardous, it must be regulated as hazardous, even if it came from hydraulic fracturing operations. This historic yet completely common sense legislation does a couple of critical things. First, it levels the playing field so that the oil and gas industry is subject to the same rules that govern pretty much every other industry in the state. Now, even though much of the waste it generates is hazardous, The hydraulic fracturing industry gets a free pass that exempts its waste from the transportation, tracking, treatment, storage, and disposal requirements that apply to other industries' waste. Second, this legislation shifts the cost of water cleanup from the taxpayers, who have to pay increased rates due to contamination of public water supplies, to the industry actors who generated the waste. Now, representatives of the natural gas drilling industry may decry such regulations as cutting into their profit margins by unnecessarily increasing the cost of doing business for waste that isn't hazardous. But they cannot have their cake and eat it too. If hydraulic fracturing wastewater is not hazardous, then Senate Bill 4616 would not in any way impact their business. If hydraulic fracturing wastewater is hazardous, there's no good reason why it should not be regulated as such. If this raises the cost of doing business, it is proper that these costs are borne by the industry rather than by the public. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today about the issues of paramount importance to New York's environment and health. We look forward to working with the committee to ensure that the risks associated with wastewater generated by hydraulic fracturing are properly evaluated and addressed before any new natural gas development is permitted to proceed in New York State.
Thanks, Mr. Ford. I appreciate it. You know, you mentioned the possibility of the disposal options, whether it's underground injection, publicly owned treatment work plants, or so on and so forth. In the research and something you were looking at, and I know that you have a brief scenario, which one of those, if this were to move forward, would be preferable?
Well, I'm not about to endorse any one of these disposal methods.
All right. I mean, I understand you have. I mean, recycling. Basically, there's still going to be an end product on recycling, correct?
Correct.
And the privately owned wastewater treatment plants, as we know, I don't believe we have any that was testified to in New York that should be actually taking any of this fluid. In fact, Pennsylvania just came up and said that they have one in the southern tier, and the underground injection was something we just asked the deputy commissioner, who said that it's something they would look at, but it doesn't seem, because of the depths and the geological formations, that's even possible in this state. And, you know, I understand your concerns with regards to, you know, if it's hazardous waste, it's hazardous waste, and it needs to be regulated. That question was asked, and they're going by a federal regulation that was put in place, and that's why they're following those rules. So in a nutshell, if really until it's labeled, in your opinion, until it's labeled hazardous waste, and you figure out a disposal method, it's something you feel strongly against, that this should not be happening in New York State, correct?
That's correct, Senator.
Okay. And not to get into a big dissertation, so your concern is truly the reason why, and concerns have been brought up, specific to this hearing, is the water and the issue of the flowback water and the chemicals that are in the water. It's not the procedure of casings or how many steel are around the casing. It strictly has to do with the water. Is that correct?
Well, there are myriad issues involved, but the quality and volume of the wastewater generated is certainly a paramount risk, as I said, and these are from DEC's numbers. There are billions of gallons that will be produced.
Based on DEC's own numbers or own formulas that you took out of the SGIS report.
That's correct.
Yeah, because I've seen those numbers. Okay. Well, like I said, I appreciate you coming here today. You raised very important concerns with regards to, you know, this process, you know, if it goes forward. And I hope that, you know, some of the things that we touched on with regards to the deputy commissioner who testified still may not answer all your questions, but it's a concern that's raised, and it's something which is the reason why we're having this hearing. So I appreciate you coming here today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Mr. Wood, thank you for your testimony. I have one question. In listening and looking through your testimony, which you provided us, you talk about existing wastewater infrastructure in the state simply not designed to accept wastewater of this sort. You mention on a number of occasions that the DEC, through their proposed regulations, has not properly dealt with it, or properly dealt with it or properly addressed it. Public treatment plants aren't equipped. Private treatment plants, none in New York, and they're huge, very expensive projects. I guess my question is it your opinion that wastewater from hydraulic fracturing can be properly dealt with? That it just hasn't to this point yet in New York State?
I think the opinion is that properly dealing with it is prohibitively expensive.
Okay, let me ask a different. I understand that point. If money was no object, which of course it is.
Right.
But if money was no object, is it your opinion that the wastewater can be properly treated or not?
I don't believe that there's any way of removing all of the possible deleterious consequences from this wastewater. Certain companies that assist in the recycling of wastewater can, at least they suggest that they can remove the heavy metals. But that's not all of the concerns. And a lot of the constituents in this wastewater would disrupt the biological systems that are used in publicly owned treatment works. Currently, the EPA is developing pretreatment standards for wastewater before sending it to POTWs. I think it would be advisable for the DEC to at least wait and see what the EPA suggests about these pretreatment programs before proceeding with this.
Okay, thank you.
And that's something they plan on coming out with in 2012?
I believe it's 2014 under the Clean Water Act.
I heard something about preliminary results coming out in 2012, but that's something we can look at. Mm-hmm. All right, Mr. Ward, again, I appreciate you coming here and giving your testimony. Thank you very much.
Thank you.